what we did in the Open Heart City project was that we reached out and found 4 emerging architects who together are now called CoLab, and you'll be meeting them as they're giving their presentation. And these 4 architects have taken the work that has been done in the studios with all of the students in Queen's and in UCD, and they've also taken the outline of the plans from Dublin City Council as to what should be done with that site. And they have come up with a draft vision document for what could happen there. So we're at an early stage in this process where what they're doing now is they're showing what the plans could look like for this site, and they're inviting, as you'll hear from them themselves, they're inviting you to kick it around. They're inviting you to hear what you want in an ideal situation. If we had government backing, if we had all of the money in the world, what should be there? Or to hear any other ideas you might have relating to this project. So you're going to see plans that look finished and perfect. And certainly to somebody like me who's not an architect at all, they look just absolutely amazing. But we're going to invite you to really understand that these are just drawings. They're just an initial view as to what could happen there, and we need to hear what you think of that, and what better ideas we should have, what other ideas we should have, and what things we should know about. So with that in mind, there's still people coming in. I'm going to invite, well, I was going to invite Denise Murray, and I see she's left her desk. There she is back again, great. So the architects themselves are going to introduce themselves and each other and show us the vision as to what could happen in this place. Thanks, Denise, over to you.
Hi everyone. We have done 6 of, well, this is number 6, and in order to disseminate, I suppose, this presentation as far and wide as possible, we're going to record it today, but just our bit, so not any of your kind of comments or contributions, but we'll be recording the bit where me, Catherine, and John and Jen are talking over our presentation, and then that will be on the Open Heart City website, and that could be shared then with anyone who hasn't been able to make one of these presentations to date. So I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, can everyone see that? Catherine, you may give me some thumbs up. Okay, thanks. Okay, so thank you everyone for giving us this opportunity to present our studies on the creation of a site of conscience in Ireland. The work we're presenting here is built on the foundation of years of work by many different people and groups, including JFMR and the CLAN project. As I said before, this is the 6th time we have presented this work, and we are collating feedback as we go through this consultation phase. It's important to note that this presentation and its contents are just one element of the work that is being done as part of the wider campaign to allow people access to their own personal records, and ultimately to create a national archive for care-related records and a centre for truth-telling. In the presentation, we start by setting the scene in terms of the national context before moving into the main part of the presentation, which relates to the proposal that the former Magdalen Laundry site at Seán McDermott Street becomes this home to the Centre for Truth-Telling and the National Archive. It's important for all of us to take a moment to think about where we are at in terms of the overall process of actually establishing this National Archive. In this image here, you see along the top in black is an indicative programme for the works at the site at Seán McDermott Street, and along the bottom in blue we've illustrated the legislative process and what's involved and what needs to be put in place so people can access their own records. Prior to the building of a national archive and site of conscience, it's essential that survivors and adopted people have immediate access to their personal records, wherever they are, and JFMR and the CLAN project are calling for legislation and policy measures that immediately ensure accessed birth certificates and all other personal data and information about relatives who died in institutions. So records will not be held in secret from those affected while the archive is being constructed. In terms of establishing a physical place for this archive and a site of conscience, we've been asked about why we are proposing Seán McDermott Street as a site. What we'd like to say is that there is no perfect place, no perfect site, but we feel that this site presents a great opportunity as it is and of itself part of the story. It's an artifact and possesses its own memories and its own stories, and it's part of the overall narrative that we are telling. The wider site is also large enough to accommodate the scale of building that we are envisaging. It is also centrally located in our capital city, and it is accessible by public transport. And for all these reasons, we think it's as valid a proposition as any. In terms of international examples, we have been looking at how other archives and centres for truth and reconciliation are managed around the world. And here we're just showing two examples. One is at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, which deals with the stories and needs of the Indigenous people of Canada, and the Find and Connect project in Australia. The Find and Connect project is an example of a resource that helps ensure immediate access to records to everyone, no matter where they're located within Australia. Looking now at Ireland and the national context. We know that there was a whole network of institutions in the 20th century in Ireland where people north and south were incarcerated. At one point in time, 1 in 100 people in the Republic were in these institutions. This was a system of a network, a system of connected institutions. And amongst these were industrial schools, reformatory schools, mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries and other care settings, including adoption and fostering. Taking just two of these examples, you can see what we've been trying to do is look at what condition these places are in today. So on the left, we have Good Shepherd Convent in Cork, which is in private ownership, has had two devastating fires in the last 10, 20 years, and has changed hands a number of times, and has currently got planning permission for 182 apartments on the site, but yet again, it's up for sale. St. Joseph's Industrial School has been taken over by GMIT and is transformed into a furniture college. And then these Magdalene laundries, the Magdalene Laundry in Clare Street in Limerick, which some time ago was taken over by Limerick Institute of Technology and is part of the Limerick School of Art and Design. And on the right, you see Seán McDermott Street, which is the Magdalene Laundry we've been talking about. And Catherine mentioned how it was proposed to be sold to a Japanese hotel chain, which is the image in the bottom corner. So at the moment, it's sitting unused. Let's look now briefly at the consultation process that we are currently undertaking. So this simple diagram represents the network of people that are involved in the project and how the process of developing a vision for the site is an iterative one and involves continuous dialogue with people at a national and local level. We are in this listening phase on the left-hand side here. This is where we are sharing our ideas with you and wider society and looking for engagement and feedback. The current circumstances we find ourselves in makes this a challenging exercise, but one that must be carried out, as we cannot expect to achieve a successful result if we do not engage and listen with people and with a wide range of views. The next step, once we've gone through enough of these consultations that we feel we've reached enough people, is reflection, where we'll reflect on all the feedback we've had and digest that. So moving now into more detail on the site. Seán McDermott Street is an interesting site, the site of a former Magdalene laundry, and we have carried out a lot of analysis on its site, on its history, on the local context. We will look at how we have developed the brief for the site and how we've brought together the analysis and the brief to create a proposal for a Centre for Truth Telling and National Archive. It's so important that we understand the social and political context in which the Magdalene laundry at Seán McDermott Street emerged. We need to acknowledge and understand the context in order to make an informed decision about the future of the site. And just before I get into this, I'd like to say that we have carried out this process on this site, but what we're really trying to do as architects is to see how we can contribute to doing things differently, to engage with people and consult with people about how you develop a site. So the methodology we're developing here is one that we hope would be used on multiple sites of conscience across the country. So in a way, this is a test bed for this more open, transparent process. It's no accident that the Magdalen Laundry was located here on the edge of the Monto. So we see it here. It's near the docks in Alderweir House where the military collected their paychecks. The Monto is also an interesting area because at the beginning of the 20th century, it was a city of women within a male-dominated world. The census figures from the time show that in some areas, the households were made up of 60% single women. Sitting within this context was another very different female enclave, the Magdalen Laundry. The area around the laundry was developed as part of the Gardner estate during the 18th and early 19th centuries. The physical fabric consisted largely of terraced houses on long, narrow plots. The city at this time had a fine grain to it, with streets lined by properties and a series of interconnected laneways and courtyards. By the end of the 19th century, this area had transformed from a once affluent area into one dominated by poor tenement housing. In this 1937 map, you can see how the clearance of the tenements began to create new, larger urban blocks where the public streets and laneways began to disappear. Today, we can see how these changes to the urban fabric have impacted on the network of streets and laneways in the area. This tendency towards the creation of large, inward-looking enclaves of housing reduces activity on the street and contributes to issues of antisocial behaviour in the public realm. The latest intervention here has been to close one of the last streets connecting Railway Street and Seán McDermott Street within this urban block. And now we have a disconnected block over a 300-metre length. And here at the centre is our site. So it's important for us to look at the local context and see what role can this site play in terms of addressing issues in the local area. So we see here that the site has a wall around it on all sides and is kind of an inward-looking site, and there's potential there for it to open up and begin to activate Railway Street. Now we're just going to look for a moment at the development of the laundry over time so that we can better understand what buildings are remaining on site. So the first buildings on site was the Females Penitence Retreat established on Mecklenburgh Street, today Railway Street. The site continued to grow, taking in the adjacent properties, a row of cottages, and then it expanded out onto 104 Gloucester Street, which is Seán McDermott Street today. There was a large expansion in 1888 to 89 with the expansion of the convent on Gloucester Street, the building of the chapel and the dispensary building, and the laundry buildings. By 1954, there was an additional building on Gloucester Street, a garden and a recreational yard had also been added. And here we are today. The convent building is still there on the main street. The women's dormitory wing returns to the rear. The chapel and the dispensary building remain, but all that remains of the laundry building is the wall along Railway Street, which we see here in this photograph. Moving now inside the convent, we've been studying what the building can tell us about the day-to-day lives of the people inside the convent and laundry. The building is very much part of the story and memory of the place. If we try to wash it away or ignore it, we are not giving it the due consideration it needs, and we're not giving due consideration to what took place here and what it can tell us about the lives of the women who lived here. Working with students from UCD and Queen's University in Belfast, we carefully recorded the journey from the front entrance to the bedrooms on the upper floor. We wanted to interrogate the building and listen to what it had to say about life in this place. Starting at the front entrance, the students drew all the details, recording this current frozen moment in time. They recorded everything from the original built fabric to the furniture and the various detritus left in the building, including things like this broken exit sign that was left on the floor. We looked at what the former Magdalen Laundry residents said about their experiences in these institutions and tried to bring this personal experience in the place together. We saw through this study that higher levels of craftsmanship and detailing were used in the more public areas, the areas that were occupied by the nuns and were on public view, such as these main staircase. And yet today, here is this space, once highly valued, fallen into disrepair and neglect. Arriving at the individual rooms of the nuns, we see the simple space that each nun had. Today, these clues to their daily life remain: a wash-hand basin, a fireplace. Unfortunately, we could not access the women's dormitory when we visited the building as it was deemed unsafe. The chapel on the ground floor is the ceremonial and public space of the convent and laundry. Here, ornate detailing and expensive materials are used to decorate the space and the altar. This is in stark contrast to the simplicity of the finishes used in the working areas and on the upper levels of the building. So far, we've been looking at the convent building and the chapel, but of course there were extensive working buildings to the rear, such as the laundry. In this plan, we see the laundry rooms, which have now been demolished, that were located here. So for orientation, that's Seán McDermott Street, and that's the convent building. So these are the buildings to the rear where the laundry was located. These plans came from the National Irish Architecture Archive. The lighter grey areas are the pieces that have been demolished. Very little information is available about the appearance of these lost interior spaces, but we do have two photographs, this one of the laundry room and this one of the packing room from the early 20th century. A parallel project has been taken, is underway as part of Queen's University Belfast's work, where they are currently researching the nature of these spaces and building a virtual model to reconstruct these lost interior spaces. Through fragments of material artifacts and oral histories, these reconstructions can be used in the future as both an educational and research tool. This, along with all the other work carried out by many other strategic partners in this section, has been informing us on the historic and present site condition and has influenced our work process. And here's the packing room. So I'll hand you over to Jen now, who's going to talk about how we see architecture having a role within the pursuit of justice. Thanks.
Thanks, Denise. I'm only going to talk briefly and then I'll come back in at the end, but we wanted to raise this question because I guess this question of how we address and atone for the injustices that were done towards so many people in Irish society is massive. It's social, it goes into education, it's legislative, and architects can only do one small part of that, but we think we do have something to add to the story. And Denise, if you go to the next slide, in answer to that question of what can architecture do in the pursuit of justice, we spent a bit of time on this, so I'm going to read it word for word, if that's okay. Because we believe that the process of moving towards a just society can be strengthened by providing physical spaces that act as permanent, visible support for those who strive for a better future. By support, we mean buildings with quiet spaces where we can go to mourn, to learn and reflect on the past and its legacy, places where records are cherished and people can come to add their own testimonies, their own stories. But there should also be active, dynamic spaces where we can actively address the past and actively plan and work towards a better, more inclusive future for everyone. So what that means in the short term and in relation to this project is the Seán McDermott Street site as envisaged as providing some of that support as part of it. It's most definitely not the answer. It has the potential to become a national site of conscience, a human rights-based world-leading centre in the pursuit of justice. And Jonathan is going to go into more detail about how we imagine putting that together.
Thanks, Jen. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about our initial process of establishing a brief, i.e. what are the functions that we could imagine taking place on this proposed site of conscience, and also what has influenced us up to this point. And the draft brief which we are presenting today, which both Catherine and Denise have said already, is very much an initial response, which we see as an ongoing and adaptable process. And it's this word process which we see as key to the way we've been working, and the idea being that through every consultation that we engage in, that we can feed your comments back into our thinking and revise our approach accordingly. So next slide, please. So from the beginning, we all agreed that we should approach this site in a way that would accommodate a range of functions and also respond to the many voices, both at a local and a national level. So I'd like to start with these drawings, which were made by a group of students at Queen's University, as tutored by Catherine Blaney from our group, and who were working on the site alongside the UCD students. And their answers to the question, how do we act in this place, were represented through a series of open and socially engaged projects. For example, theatre, nursery, archive, exhibition, community garden, workers' clubs, which you can see here on the slide. So this was the ethos of social engagement and collectivity, which we brought with us as we were starting to develop and establish the brief for the site. Next slide, please. So the site at Seán McDermott Street is a very large city centre site. It's around 2 acres and it's located just 500 metres from O'Connell Street, so the central street in the city. And from our research and from speaking to locals and engaging with Dublin City Council and other parties, and also through these initial consultations, we've started to piece together a brief for the site that has the potential to address the needs of the many voices and also be transformative for the area and for the local community. So as a starting point, we've broken the brief down into 5 categories. So we've, on the left-hand side, we have the 3rd level education, which is around 10,000 square meters. And then we have a Centre for Excellence and early years childcare, which is 500 square meters. We have community spaces, we have social housing, and in the centre, we have the Centre for Truth Telling and Archive of Institutional Adoption and Care-related Records. And many of these functions have been identified through various reports and commissions and also through the testimonies of survivors, which we've listed here on the right-hand side. So if we go to the next slide, please. So I guess that the Centre for Truth Telling and Archive is the part of the programme which we've been focusing the most of our attention on over the last months, as we see this as part of the programme which can really act as the focal point for the site, and it can offer a range of functions and services. And when we think of archive, we often think of a building that simply stores records, a kind of a sort of a closed space. And that is the case for much of it, what we call the passive part of it. But what very much interests us is the associated functions as part of that archive, what we call the active spaces, as they can be the functions which can help to interweave the various programs on the site with the other functions like community and 3rd level education. And so we've listed out here in this slide a couple of those active functions. So research and archive support services, then spaces for survivors and adopted persons to gather, to meet and to share and to discuss. Spaces for education and learning, and this was something that became very strongly from some of the reports that we were reading, this idea of education and educating youth as well. Importantly, connecting the archive to other resources, not just within the site, but also to the local community and at a national level. Having exhibition spaces for both permanent exhibitions that could be in some of the larger spaces on the site, and also temporary installations that would happen just for a few months. Also performance and gathering spaces, and then as Jennifer will go into in a few moments, the idea of green outdoor spaces in the city, and also spaces for contemplation and contemplation, exactly. So if we go to the next slide, please. So what we've done is, just to give you a sense of what that means, if you see the site here, this is a site plan of Seán McDermott Street. We've tried to just, if you imagine this functions laid out on one level, this is what it would look like. So what we've started to do as well is position certain parts of the brief on the site plan itself. So for example, if we start from left to right, we could imagine that the 3rd level education could go in this corner where the laundry once was. So that's the kind of largest open space in the site. It could accommodate that function. That part of the early years centre, which you see in green, could be accommodated in part of the existing building. That maybe housing, which you see as the red, could go in this little kind of empty plot between the dispensary and an existing residential building. We have a strange piece of site behind the old facade of the Presbyterian Church, and the idea being that maybe we could fit some community functions in there. And at the very center of the plan then is the Center for Truth Telling and Archive. And this is really this is the piece that we see as the focal point that could be in parts of the existing building, that could also have parts of new build as well, which we'll go into detail in a moment. So if we go to the next slide. And what's also been very important, and what we've done alongside this kind of more, so going into real detail about the building, has been the more basic analysing what is the capacity of this building, what can it hold. So at the moment we've identified that the existing area is around 4,500 square metres. And that's between the existing convent building and the chapel and the dispensary building. So what does that mean actually in terms of area? If we go to the next slide, it'll give you maybe a good sense. So if we take the total brief, which we've identified, which is around 17,000 square meters, which is this big black circle, and we take the existing building, which is the red, that means that the existing building could accommodate about a quarter of these functions. So we'd need another 75% of new builds on the site then to accommodate this. So Jennifer will talk you through a bit more of that in detail in a moment. And first I'll just pass you on to Catherine, who's going to go through the working methodology a bit further. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Catherine. So I'm going to talk about the work methodology, and the work methodology deals more with how we deal with the physical site and make our interventions or propositions on the physical site. And so what we've been doing all along is asking ourselves the question of how do we act in this place, and if we want a different answer, then we need to work in a different or new or innovative way. So Johnny has introduced you to an innovative way in which we can tackle the brief. But we also need to find an innovative way in which we can act on the physical site that we've been presented, that has been presented to us, and it's vast and it's huge, so it's something that we have to put a lot of thought into how we're going to work. So in our methodology then we found that we wanted to work in two ways. One of the ways was how we dealt with the physical material still on the site, through using or looking at historical material, the present physical material that's left on the site, and then the future material, or what we present to build the building from. And then the other way that we're going to look at the site is spatially. So we looked at the site through the historical rooms, the present rooms, and the future rooms that we want to put on the site. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll see the first image that we're looking at is a very careful reading, or a drawing that we made that's a very careful reading of the site. And we called this drawing Bestial Traces. And what you'll see with what we've done with this drawing is that we've carefully drawn nearly everything, where we've drawn the plan of the laundry, we've drawn the walls, we've drawn the floors, so we've drawn everything. And this is a record of the physical material that's left on the site, and it's really, really important because the physical material that's there is physical proof of what happened to the people that were kept within these institutions, but also they are triggers for material, for memory, so that for research and for education, and they are a record of the kind of material history or material culture of these places. So the material that's left on the site is really, really important to record and for us to think about carefully. If we move on to the next slide. But the drawing that we presented before, it has all of the information, so it's lots and lots of information. So what we need to do is we need to start to make judgments as architects about what are the key parts of the site that we need to make sure that we see of to keep this material history. So this drawing that we have here we've called a reconstruction drawing. And in this drawing, what we've recorded is the content that is implicit in this place to retain its material memory. So what you'll see in this drawing is what is the content that's implicit. It's things like the doorways of the buildings that the women entered the institutions through, and the children. It's the walls of the laundry with the fans still left within the walls. The feet of the machinery are recorded here, the tiles and the surfaces. So all of these things are really, really important for us to decide then what are the key aspects that describe the material memory of this place. So if we move on to the next slide then, because we'd done these like really careful forensic analysis drawings, then we could start to make this next drawing, which is about the retention of what we want to retain on the site, and then how we actually start to remove parts of the building fabric from the site to enable us to propose something that's new. So in this drawing, what you can see is with the black lines represent what we have now thought that is really, really important for us to retain. And then the red lines is where we've started to decide very carefully what parts of the site we can start to remove to enable us to start to make propositions that are new. And with what we've retained, we've very carefully, in what we're beginning to propose, we've very carefully woven these into to propose new built fabric on the site. So we've very carefully woven it into the existing material. So if we move on to the next slide. So now that we've established a language in which we want to deal with the material that's left on the site, now we have to decide as architects, like what we do is we deal with space, and we want to decide how we want to act in a place spatially. And with this drawing, what we're showing, and this is actually kind of a recap on everything that we've done before, is that we realized that we already had a language that we'd established because we'd done so much work already by the time we kind of got to this point, or in this point of the presentation, that we already had a language that we were looking at the site, or a lens that we were looking at the site through. And one of those was time. Where we were looking at the site in its past form, in its present form, and then we were starting to think about how we propose something in the future. But the other was through the scale of its rooms. So we kept looking at the site through the lens of the scale of its rooms. So through its past rooms, through this reconstruction project of the laundries that was connected to oral history, and how we record oral history, and that's the research project. The present, where the students went into the site and they recorded everything that was actually still present on the site. And then the future, where the way that the project was set up was that the students started to propose these new rooms in the site, and they were able to deal with the scale that was very personal to the people that were going to inhabit the site, but also the complexity of the brief because they acted collectively. But again, they started at the scale of the rooms. So if we move on to the next slide. And in this reconstruction axonometric drawing, you can begin to see the rooms, the rooms that the women once inhabited. And the way that they almost look in the drawing is that they're woven together almost like a tapestry. So if we move on to the next one. So the way that we work as architects is that we don't just work linearly. So whenever we work, we don't just do this forensic analysis and then that kind of brings us to the conclusion. How we kind of design things is it's really important that we have conversations, that we refine things through labor, and that we make observations. And one thing that came up quite a lot was this woven city plan. And the city was historically built through the labor of men, but with the way that we wanted to work, we wanted to give the agency to people who didn't normally have a voice in the city. So this Annie Alber's tapestry was a way in which we could possibly find a means to weave the history of the city in, or the history of the site in, with what we wanted to propose new and make a new city plan. So it's a new city plan drawn for this place. And then with this site plan we took the historical fabric, and then within it, then we started to weave what was new into the plan. And through this, then we ended up with permeable and open civic scale rooms using the laundry's vestial traces. And I'm going to pass on.
I'm going to show you what we're actually talking about in terms of buildings or ideas about buildings. So implementation means, in our case, how we put the history of the site as explained by Denise, and the range of functions as Johnny talked about, and then our particular way of working that we've managed to figure out, put them all together and actually make design proposals. So if you go to the next slide, we started with quite a simple concept, which was three things. The first was an idea about large rooms in the city that would talk to each other across the site, even if the functions were different. So these large rooms are spaces where people gather in the city. So they're they're lecture spaces or theatre spaces or an exhibition space, an archive. They're big, important civic rooms, and that we don't hold them apart from each other, but that they get to start having a conversation with each other and then benefit from each other. And then those rooms and those buildings are accessed through a series of courtyards that connect them all. And by courtyards, I mean active, vibrant courtyard spaces, the kinds of courtyards where people gather, where you can have an event or a market or a cinema screening. And then the last thing is the addition of gardens, because this is a very hard part of the city, and it's a kind of a simple but important idea of ours that we want to bring green space back into this part of town. We want to bring birdsong back into this part of town. So when those are held apart, they're quite simple, but leading on from what Catherine was talking about with weaving, if you go to the next slide, next slide. Here, we start to weave them together, so the connections between things start to become more complicated. If you go to the next slide again, what we do then is we start distributing these functions across the site. So it's not so much dividing things up into plots, it's really getting them to start trying to interact with each other. So this is a site that has different users on it. There's research and learning, there's also reflection, contemplation, and space for the local community, which is obviously important in any site. If you keep going, if we go right back to what Denise was talking about at the very beginning, the way this site has been cut off from the city again and again and again over time, we try to reverse this in part in that we start to make a series of new entranceways and laneways and access points that bring people into the center of this site for the first time in forever. But we still maintain this idea of it as an inward looking site, which is also important as a part of the city. If you go again, so then you start to see what these courtyards are doing. So the courtyards are acting almost like outdoor rooms in the city. They're connecting, for example, the university to the early years center, to the exhibition space, to the archive building. If we go to the next slide. So this is a quick sketch visualization of what we mean. We're you can think of it almost like a mini city, that there's lots of different functions happening at the same time. They're connected by streets and squares and green spaces, and they're active and vibrant. On to the next one, and I'm going to start zooming in a little bit on what I mean in detail. So this is the corner of Railway Street, which looks south and would be the third level education entrance, or an idea about it. These are all just ideas. The idea is that you could walk by and you would look into these large lecture spaces of the city. So you would see students studying, there'd be activity on the street. We have an example on the next page, which is of the Bocconi University in Milan by an Irish firm called Grafton Architects, where people are gathering to go into a lecture actually below ground, but the connection to the city is really strong and everyone can see what everyone else is doing. On the next slide, exactly, the archive, which we purposefully put in the center of this site, that has two access points. That you can access it from the main street, from Seán McDermott Street, and then also from Railway Street. So it's really becomes really permeable and you can kind of weave your way through. And it's set up as a series of rooms. So from left to right, we have exhibition spaces. Then we have a new foyer between the exhibition spaces and what's right now the chapel. I'll show you an example of what that could be in a second. And then we have another one of our active courtyards, and that courtyard then opens up to the new archive building, because records need to be carefully stored, as we all know, so we would have to build a new building in order to look after them. It would be very difficult to do it in the existing. The next slide. So this is that gap, an example of what we could do with that gap. This is the new extension to the National Gallery of Ireland, and this was kind of a nothing space before, and now it's a really nice moment to arrive and pause for a second. And then another sketch about this relationship between the new buildings, the archive, these outdoor spaces, and the existing museums, the existing buildings, excuse me, and then also finally, just to make the point that an archive can have these quiet spaces, like on the left, what we know of, like bookshelves, tons and tons of bookshelves where everyone's files are stored, and that's secure and that's not really accessible. But then there's another part to an archive which is about disseminating information. So, for example, on the right-hand side, and this is an example from the Stasi Museum in Germany, there are people's stories. So this is the part that's important for education, for schools to get the bus up to Dublin and hear these stories and become educated on the topic. And then finally, there's always been an idea about an element of housing in this part of the site, and or in the site itself, and we chose this part of the site because it's a little bit quieter. It's a bit more protected from the rest of the site. It connects into an existing block of buildings, and that would also, in the idea, along with this idea of gardens and courtyards, would have its own garden at the back. And I think we have one example on the next slide of that, exactly in two different ways. So one is that this idea of the housing when it's looking into a little green space where kids are playing, and another one where maybe there aren't as many kids, it's more formal and it's very relaxed and calm. And I'm going to pass over to Denise to finish up.
Thank you. So just in conclusion, as you can see, I hope from our presentation that our proposal and our approach hasn't been plucked out of thin air, that it's not a one-hit wonder project, and we are in no way aiming to sensationalize our dark heritage. We hope that you think that it is a thoughtful and careful response that has emerged from engaging with the research, the history, and the place. As architects, we have tried to bring our experience and knowledge of the built environment to this difficult subject. We have tried to develop a methodology for addressing these difficult sites that can be applied to other sites across the country. We've tried to show how, through a deep understanding of the history and nature of a site, a proposal can emerge that allows for the old and the new to be woven together, retaining the character of the old while breathing life into the new. We've spent nearly a year researching and contemplating this site. Over 50 architecture students and teachers have invested their time and energy into the project so far. Our objective now is to work with you and a wide range of local and national parties to establish a satisfactory answer to this question: how should we act in this place? Thank you.